And welcome back to the Financially Simple Experience. Friends, I hope you're having a good day. Joining me in studio today is Mr. Matteo Valles. Did I say that properly?
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yes.
Yeah, nailed it.
Nailed it. Hey, friends, make a note. Send me some props out on social media and tag Matteo. We'll get you all his contact information. Say, Goodbread, way to nail it on the first name there. But now, Matteo is Vice President of Business Transition with Sunbelt Brokers here in East Tennessee. And today we're going to talk about the business process transitioning, selling, buying businesses from a broker's perspective. I believe that's what you are, right? A broker.
Yep, business broker.
So talk to me about what a business broker does.
So for the most part, at least me personally, I represent sellers. So current business owners, typically they're looking to retire, maybe sell their business to buy another business. And I help them through that whole process, similar to a seller's agent in real estate. Now, I will say the main difference between this and real estate from a broker's perspective is the deals I typically work on, there's only one broker. In real estate, you work with your agent, the buyer works with their agent, they go back and forth. Here, I kind of sit somewhere in the middle. I'm always representing the seller and their interests, but a lot of times I kind of have to help the buyer as well. They're a first-time business buyer. They maybe don't know where to get financing. Maybe they don't have an attorney, CPA, stuff like that. And I kind of have to help them along through that process and kind of be that cushion in between both parties there.
So let's talk about the process then. If you're acting as the mediator, let's call it, between both parties, obviously you're representing the seller because you're listing their business for sale, trying to find the qualified buyer to purchase the business. But then you step in that mediation type role where you're trying to consummate the deal, get the deal to fruition. What does that process look like? I know there's lots of points. I actually wrote about this in my first book, The Ultimate Sale. So we've got lots of points there, but kind of give me an overarching theme about what a typical transaction looks like from a business broker standpoint.
Yeah, so again, people know real estate, so I like to relate it to real estate in terms of it's a similar beginning process of, let's say it's a first-time home seller. I'm going to come in and I'm typically going to educate them on the process, which is going to take about 6 to 12 months. So longer time frame there. But I'll help value the business by looking at the financials, understanding intangibles of the business that maybe make the value more or less than what would just be on a financial basis. We'll put together all the marketing, which again, in comparison to real estate, it's a couple paragraphs and some pictures for real estate. This, I've put together 80-page documents, and it takes hours of interviews with the owner. So a little more complicated there. But then ultimately we market to buyers, we help negotiate between the two of them, and then push everybody towards closing and arranging attorneys and CPAs and financing and everything like that.
So friends, I want you to pick up on a couple of key words that we talked about on the podcast. If you go back to episodes like about 50 to episode 90, we dealt with a couple of terms here that Matteo just mentioned. He mentioned intangible assets versus tangible assets. I want to kind of dissect this if I can. Whenever you're looking at intangible, I've always believed that intangible assets are what can actually create synergy and greater value versus just books or cash or equipment. From your perspective, how important is making intangible assets paramount, pristine, the pinnacle of the business?
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely important. For example, so I know some business owners that they've told me they work 60 hours a week, 80 hours a week. They sleep under their desk sometimes. And so when I'm looking at, what the value of it would be just on financials, I have to kind of discount the fact that not a lot of buyers are going to want to buy a business that they have to work 80 hours a week for. Yep. On the other side, I'm working with a business right now where the owner works 3 days a week, and every time I've been in there, he's working on personal stuff. So it doesn't take much effort from him. That lowers the risk to a buyer because they don't really have a role that they need to fill, and also gives them a better lifestyle. So the buyer pool is going to be much, much greater. Many more people are going to be interested in it, and that can drive up the price significantly.
And that'll actually increase the multiple then with valuation standpoint. Yeah, because we call that company-specific risk. If you can reduce the owner dependence within the company, you actually drive the greater value because you're now selling the golden goose, theoretically.
Exactly.
Am I right?
And every buyer I talk to, that's the kind of business they want. There's not a lot of them out there. So if you have a business like that, the amount of buyers wanting it is going to be much, much higher.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So another term you talked about was valuation. Whenever you're doing valuation, are you using a multiple of EBITDA? Are you using 2 times earning? Is it industry specific? How do you go about determining the value of a company? I know that you're not an ABA or a CBA. I don't think you have either one of those credentials. But how does a business broker go about looking at the value of a company?
So it kind of depends on the size of the business. I would say typically if it's EBITDA under $1 million or under maybe $750,000, we're going to be going off what is called SDE or seller discretionary earnings. And that is essentially what it feels like you're making as the owner. So we're looking at net profit, obviously, first and foremost, but then any salaries the owner's paying themselves. Is there health insurance, car insurance, any other personal benefits going through the business? We would add that back.
Right.
And we would determine what the multiple on that number is. Now, as EBITDA gets a little bit higher, the buyer pool changes a little bit. You know, if you're valuing a business on SDE, it's because you think the buyer is going to be somebody, an individual who wants to feed their family with the business. They're going to be working in the business 40 hours a week. The larger the business gets, the more likely it's maybe a private equity firm, strategic buyer, and then it becomes more of buying an investment as sort of buying a job. And so then you start to value it off EBITDA.
So what you're referring to, I think we use the term normalization of the financial statement. That's what you're referring to as you're adding back items. So I'm actually working through about 7 of these right now, working with various private equity firms and such. And we're looking at adding back, obviously, compensations to the owners, cell phones, travel expenses. And what are some other areas that you often see in add backs?
They might have some sort of health insurance premiums, car insurance. Sometimes they bought their personal cars through the business. They might be paying their wife or kids to the business, but they don't actually do anything in the business. Stuff like that. Gotcha.
So we're talking about the transitioning of business, and we're looking at it from the seller's perspective. What would be, from a seller's perspective, the one key nugget that you would say, hey, friends, because we have a ton of business owners who are hearing this right now. Hey, friends, if you're thinking about selling your business in the next 10 years, let's put a 10-year time frame on there. Here are some things from your perspective as a business broker, the person in the trenches moving businesses from the seller to the buyer. Here's some things that you really should focus on. What would they be?
So obviously, if you're trying to increase the value of the business, the first thing that buyers are going to see is just financial. So obviously, if there's any ways that you can decrease costs or anything, that's an easy first step. Otherwise, I can't stress enough removing yourself from the business. The risk that decreases to a buyer and the amount of buyer pool that opens up is enormous. And it can be tough because it's your business. You want to jump in. You want to solve the problems. It's very hard to fight. When there's an issue, you want to jump in and solve it as opposed to sit back and see if anybody else can take care of it. But the more you can fight that and the more you can develop the talent within your team and remove yourself from that role, not only does your life become easier while running the business, but the amount of buyers that you'll attract is much higher.
Now, we haven't talked about these questions beforehand, so these are new right off the cuff. You and I did not plan any of these answers, correct? No. What's interesting, friends, is Matteo just gave the thesis for my book, Your Baby's Ugly, because most business owners, as you said, we view it as their baby. They're in it. They're working 60, 70 hours a week, but the buyer doesn't want to buy a job. They don't want to come in and work 60, 70, 80 hours a week. And so by us removing ourselves as business owners from the epicenter of our business, we actually in turn drive the value through the roof. Am I correct?
Yes, 100%.
Sweet. So we're looking at it from a seller's perspective. If let's say somebody's listening and they say, hey, Justin, Matteo, I really have some extra cash that I want to deploy. I'm interested in buying a business. What advice would you give to somebody who wants to buy a business?
So I think it would be more so advice on the front end of looking to buy a business can be discouraging. It can take a long time because there's going to be a specific type of industry and revenue range and profitability range that you're looking for. And there's just not millions of those out there. And then within the small group that you're looking for, you have to catch somebody at the right time that they're looking to sell and they respond to your cold email or your mail or whatever it was, your phone call. And so it can take a long time to find the right business, to get it under contract, to go through due diligence. And at any of those parts, it could fall apart. There's another buyer, whatever it might be. I know I've had bidding wars before, and for the people who lose out, it's not a fun call to them. And I can tell that they're discouraged, and sometimes they end up taking 2 years off of continuing to look for a business. And so I think just being ready up front to know that it will be challenging is most important there.
Okay, so just the time constraints, the emotions involved, trying to, it's almost, I hate to equate it to adoption, but that really is what it deals with. If you know family members that adopted children, it's just a long, drawn-out process that you got to be willing to have the energy and the time to go through it.
Yeah, and again, for both those things, knowing that it's very rewarding at the end, but it will take a lot of effort and time and emotional fortitude up front.
So here's a question that I've heard, and I've talked to hundreds of business brokers in my career. And I don't know if you knew this, I've already sold 3 businesses, so I've
Okay.
gone through the whole process. Have currently owned 3 businesses, walk clients up to either the business broker, the M&A world, or the VC world, and trying to drive the value of their businesses up for preparation. But not everybody works with a value growth firm like ours.
Hmm.
A lot of times, business owners, because we're a really quirky lot. We think we can do everything ourselves, right?
Hmm.
I mean, we business owners, like I often say, we're willing to charge hell with a water pistol. I mean, that's just who we are, right? And you see it every
Yeah.
single day. Man, how many times have you had a business owner come to you and say, my business is ready to sell? You look at the financials and you're like, dude, this is nowhere near what you think it's worth, or this is nowhere near ready to sell. How often does that happen?
It's pretty often. It's amazing what you'll run into sometimes. I remember I had a business owner kept asking for tax returns, tax returns, tax returns. Eventually, he sent me a hand filled in tax return of just 1 page, and it became clear. I think he doesn't have tax returns. And if you don't have tax returns, nobody's going to lend on it. People aren't going to trust the financials. You can't sell that business. Um, Another one, they thought they were ready to sell, but then they disclosed that their customers have explicitly told them when he leaves the business, they're taking their business elsewhere.
Yep.
And it doesn't matter what the financials say. It doesn't matter how good the employees are. That business is essentially worth the equipment value.
Right, right.
So sometimes there are some painful conversations in there and letting them know it will take a significant amount of time to get this ready.
What happens? Let's say somebody comes to you and they say, "Hey, Matteo, I need just pick an easy number, $1 million. I'm from the sell of my business in order for me to sell off in the sunset." And you go through your process and you have an appraisal and you're like, "Dude, this thing's only worth like 500,000. That's max." What advice do you give that business owner when you're showing that there's a great discrepancy between what they expect they need or what they think they need from the business versus what it's worth?
So the first step I always tell them then is to go talk to their financial planner and kind of get an idea of, if the business was to stay at the same value, just how many more years would they need to work maybe to sell it at what it is currently valued at. The next step is then I'll give them some tips and some guidance on what increases the value of a business, whether it's removing themselves out of the business. Maybe I've reviewed a bunch of financials. Maybe I realize their insurance costs is much higher than it needs to be, and I compare them up with people to lower those costs, to just try to increase that bottom line to make it more valuable, or just overall they need to grow the top line revenue perhaps as well. But a lot of times, what I've seen, to be honest, is that the business owners are typically when they're talking to me, they're ready to sell and they're kind of more in checked out mode where they just want to maintain the business. And so then it really comes down to they just need to work a couple more years, unfortunately, until that 500,000 or so is appropriate for them, because they just aren't as gung ho and ready to grow the business as they used to be.
Gotcha. So we've talked about the business broker world from the buyer's perspective, from the seller's perspective. We've talked about what happens if they're not quite ready to sell. But let's assume, for this next question, let's assume that we do have a willing buyer and a willing seller, and they both are looking at the numbers. They agree the numbers are there, and it's passed the sniff test, if you will, from the buyers, sellers. Now we enter in the bank. We enter in this player, right? And I can see money's coming from traditional lending from a bank. I can see money's coming from the Small Business Association, maybe SBA. I can see perhaps venture capital firms or angel investors, depending on what all we're dealing with. What has been your experience when it comes to dealing with the financial side of this in terms of bank versus SBA versus venture capital firms of that nature? Which do you prefer to work with?
So I definitely have my preferred lenders in town. The SBA is pretty slow. I've heard people compare them to the DMV of the financing world.
Yeah.
So if you have time on your hands and you don't have enough for a significant down payment, it's kind of your best option. I do work with good lenders that make the process not so painful, but traditional lenders are typically my favorite. They're kind of the good mix of speed and just effort that you need to get them across the finish line as well. Private equity can kind of be tricky sometimes. Sometimes they're trying to do deals in just sort of real creative fashions and whatnot. And a lot of business owners I find are a little more traditional, and they want a small seller carry. They want most of their money up front. They aren't interested in earnouts. And so sometimes bridging that gap between the private equity firm's desires and the business owner's desires can be a little tougher there.
Gotcha. Makes sense. So I love to learn. You probably realize that with books all around. You've seen The Office here. I have books everywhere. I love to learn, love to teach. I got to ask you, what is one book that you've read recently, last year or so, that you're like, dude, if you could read this one book, I would recommend you read it?
So I really liked it. I'm not a long books kind of scare me. So I like the short ones. Okay. And typically I find the short ones.
Do you have pictures in yours?
No pictures. But
I'm joking, obviously, because I have pictures in mine.
Okay, there we go.
Look at it like a coat. No.
So a short one that I really enjoyed is How Did You Do It, Truett? And it's about Truett Cathy, the founder of Chick-fil-A. Quick read, you could knock it out in a day. And two things that it just kind of reminded me of is, one, anything great takes a long time and a lot of effort to build, even if it's a chicken sandwich. And he talks about the years of just getting the spices right, testing it with customers. And I don't know, I figured, I guess maybe he just made the chicken sandwich and started selling it. There wasn't years of R&D in it. Yeah. And then the second was that riding trends in the market that go along with your business can be a huge just wave to ride to increase your business. And the main one he used was when Chick-fil-A was growing, malls started to become a thing in America. Right. And they made sure they were in every mall. And as malls became more popular, they got in more of them, and they grew in popularity as well. So I thought that was really interesting.
Interesting. So folks listening to you right now range in demographics, right? So we have startups, business owners. We have business owners that are pushing 100 million in revenue right now. They're listening to us as we talk. And tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people are listening to our voice. You know, you have a very diversified background. We didn't dive too much into it for sake of time today, but you work with Deloitte. I mean, you've done some pretty amazing things in your young career at this point. So I'm going to ask you the question that I typically reserve for people that have a lot more gray hair than you or I, and that is this. If you had one pearl of wisdom with your backdrop, your backstory, and friends, we're going to talk about how you can learn more about Matteo and what his history and what his experience is. Let me tell you, he's well-versed, which is why we want him on the show. With your history, with your knowledge, your experience, what is that one pearl of wisdom that you would like business owners to take away? They can just dwell on, noodle, if you will, in their mind over the next 24, 48 hours.
So the one thing is the piece of advice I would like to give that I don't think you would normally hear, people would normally think about, is when you do have a buyer come in to the fold there and you start kind of talking to them and whatnot, I think it's important to somewhat get them emotionally interested in the business. And what I mean by that is, you know, if you went to a car lot and you asked to see the minivans, the salesman's probably going to confirm, do you have kids? Because that would be the assumption. And if you do, they're going to show you the minivan, and they're probably going to talk about how the kids can sit in the back, and there's the TVs, and, you know, they're going to really enjoy it. And they try to paint this picture of what it would be like to own this car. Right. Same with a house. Why do you stage a house? So they can imagine what it's like to live in there and the furniture and whatnot. So if you can tie that in some way to the business, I've found that to be very, very strong. And what I mean by that, an example was I was selling a manufacturing company last year, and I had the owner. When the guy came in, he was with his wife. I could tell he wanted to be more of a handyman and impress his wife. So I said, hey, let him run the table saw so he can imagine what it's like to work in here. When he did, his eyes lit up, and he eventually offered over asking price. Wow. So, you know, I'm working at a pool supply store right now. When they come in, testing water is really important. I let the buyer go through, test the water, see what it's like, see how easy it is, imagine himself doing it. So stuff like that, I find you get that little emotional connection, and it can really increase their interest in the business.
And I'm making the assumption that works whenever you have somebody who maybe is not already in the business or they're buying a business to move into. What about that strategic buyer, that one that says, hey, your business will perfectly mesh into mine because you offer X and we have Y? How do you engage them in that same mentality, that same approach?
Yeah, so obviously it's a little bit different there. I would say with that, you know, don't just leave it up to the strategic buyer to see how well the businesses will fit together. Either, you know, the seller or the business broker can kind of do some research and try to figure out really how these businesses will go well together and what that end goal and that picture of those two merged together will look like, and really try to sell that vision to them. I think would be a good way to still kind of get them maybe emotionally attached to it.
So one question I skipped over that I really want to nail down is this. When should a business owner start conversations with a business broker? At what point should they engage that?
So I don't think it's ever too early. I've had people who just started businesses and they want to talk to me. Happy to talk to them. I think it's typically your business is going to be one of your biggest assets when you get close to retirement. And I think it's, you know, you're tracking what your 401k or your IRA is, but to not be tracking your business along the way, I think is somewhat of a mistake there. So I recommend it's never too early to reach out to a business broker. Obviously, as you get closer to retirement age, you're in your 50s or 60s, it becomes more and more important. But I would say if you think you're going to sell within 3 years and you haven't talked to a business broker, you need to call one.
Gotcha. So my guest today is Matteo Valles. If I say that right again,
Yes.
Valles. Yes, got it right 2 times in a row. Vice President of Business Transitions at Sunbelt Business Brokers here in East Tennessee. He is in our turf here in East Tennessee, so I had him come to the studio today to have this conversation. So Matteo, if somebody had a question for you following up, they want to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to contact you?
So email is always the best for me, which is mvallis@sunbeltnetwork.com. But they can also go to matteovallis.com. I have some resources mainly focused on East Tennessee, but guides on selling your business and whatnot there as well.
Perfect. So friends, we'll put both of those, that URL for his website and his email address, in the show notes below. Matteo, man, thanks for joining us today on the Financially Simple podcast.
Thanks for having me, Justin.
Friends, look, I realize life is hard. We start talking about our largest asset. You heard it from Matteo, the business broker, often say that our business can consist of 80-90% of our total net worth. So we want to make sure our business is growing at a rapid rate. You should be able to outpace Wall Street, but you need to get the right team involved. I realize this is complicated. It is hard. It's frustrating. It doesn't have to be. Hey, let's continue to make our lives at least financially simple. Y'all go out and make it a great day.